Do 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 do. Extras.
Since before the Polaron arc, I've been recording every session, or trying to. As I've said before, the recordings are terrible. That's why so few little chunks are both entertaining enough and of a sufficient audible quality that I can turn them into precious moments videos. But they don't need clear audio to be tremendously valuable in providing me with genuine player reactions, in-character dialogue, etc., as well as the information I need to, mostly, reconstruct some of the complex battles. Which is still challenging, given I didn't take pictures of every turn. Or any turns. I should have taken map pictures. This means it really hurts when I run into an episode where I forgot to record, there was one of those, or where the recording ran out of space on my craptacular Chromebook, or otherwise got corrupted at the end of the night. Well, it ran out of space halfway through Krillidin's supercharged bow rampage against Large Force in number 54, and then the recording failed entirely for everything in this episode, including the first half of the battle that will happen in episode 56. This is made extra crappy because this was during the period that a lot of my GM notes were being scribbled on paper at work or on the bus, and most, including these episodes, did not survive. Now, I knew most of the things that happened in these sessions. I knew exactly how the Titanic Zombies encounter ended, with the big one skidding to a stop just before reaching Black and Little One. I knew they looted and identified the Black Hammer, but not the stuff in the portable hole. And I knew that nobody ended up with the Shadow Blade. There's even a non-zero chance that I forgot to award it or let Draven detect it without touching it, though that's much less fun. I knew Viktor's script, that part I did have digital notes for, probably because I wrote it right after the night where Kaiser's speech was interrupted. Very rude. I knew they visited the Darktree, and all made the sacrifice, and I knew they reached the army guarding Deathmoor at the Oluwana Spring. But without a record, I was stuck having to figure out almost all the other details of this adventure that happened more than 5 years ago IRL. Sure, I could fudge some numbers for Krillidin's shots in the rounds after the recording cut out. The individual to hit rolls don't matter, since I knew the result, and we actually had good information on the first half of Krill's killing spree. But I had to write 100% of the dialogue for episode 55 from scratch, based on my knowledge of the players and their characters and hints from my very fallible memory. Now, everyone liked the episode, including the players. They thought it was great, so I clearly kept them in character. And honestly, most of Little One's lines, including the delivery, sound so right and so familiar to me that I may have reconstructed the actual lines from faint memory and or included lines I remembered him saying from other nights. I really don't feel like I made up the exchange where Little One asks, "Rygax, did you swear an oath not to talk about the bad place?" "No." "Then try again." I wouldn't be surprised if I find near identical lines spoken by him in a later recording. But there are two big stupid problems with my reconstruction. A, I'm not sure they used Windwalk. I don't remember how they got from place to place in a reasonable amount of time. I'm pretty sure it wasn't the horses. As the note in the episode explained, we didn't realize there was a level 4 mass phantom mount spell, and using the level 5 one I made up, which seemed reasonable for level 5, that's too high level a spell for Draven to create without sitting around for hours spending XP to craft an actual scroll. Windwalk would have worked just fine. Black could easily have memorized it, let them make Rygax's little side trip, but in the recording I have for the second half of episode 56, there's no reference to it, which either means they didn't Windwalk, or we all forgot, which is a possibility since we were starting a new session mid-battle, or it got dispelled. Regardless, though, this is a pain in the ass for weaving all the facts of the upcoming battle into a coherent narrative. B, there was an actual point to the Raj's appearance. As much as I love popping up with our friendly neighborhood Rakshasas, I generally don't unless they're presenting a relevant choice. Now, they did suggest an alternate route to avoid running into a Vampire King, But in the very end of the recording of the next session, after I had stopped transcribing to work on 55, there was a reference to an offer that the Rajas made during this appearance in 55. So now I have to figure out how to work that into the next episode, which may be as crappy as adding it during the previously. This Viktor scene wasn't part of my original plan, but about the first thing you learn about being a game master is plans change. Even though I brutally railroaded the PCs by forcing them to hear at least a third of Kaiser's dialogue before I let them interrupt the hell out of him, I still wanted to add this context to what they and Rygax were doing, even though it was unlikely to change anything or even make them seriously reconsider. Ironically, if they did heed his warnings, it would have stopped them from going after Swain's enemy, Baron Deathmore. But, of course, Kaiser didn't know their actual objective. Now, relating to the lack of notes above, I wish I had their actual reactions to Viktor, because that would have been really interesting. The way I present them in the video is very on brand for each character, and probably pretty close to what happened. For example, I know Black didn't go for the duel, and I know this time I got out all my text since the messenger was literally invulnerable, basically just zoom bombing them. And I remember that they found Viktor fairly humorous despite how unfunny his actual message was. Obviously, Kaiser has a thick elven accent, while Viktor has a very different cartoonishly thick accent and speech pattern. And to answer a user question, no, Viktor's voice is not inspired by the Russian character from Yuri on Ice. I haven't seen it. Viktor is just another version of my intentionally terrible quote-unquote Russian accent, which I use for Drow. I revealed in a previous extras that Kaiser is an Eternal Blade, an elf-specific prestige class from Tome of Battle, which links you to a spirit guide, an ancient warrior who shares their wisdom and experience with you. But while Viktor is clearly his spirit guide, it is equally clear that despite being apparently invulnerable and harmless when the party met him, this red silhouette does a lot more than the typical glowing ball guardian. The spirit described by the class has to stay within a certain range of the Eternal Blade, cannot sense beyond that radius, and various other limitations. They mostly just give bonuses to certain actions when you call upon their wisdom. By contrast, thanks to whatever spirit shackle or shackles grant Kaiser this partner, Viktor seems able to function independently and quite some distance from the warrior to whom he is bonded. When Kaiser suggests that if Swain were to remove him, the next bearer of his powers would likely not be a match for Viktor, it's because this power requires a living elf, or Eladrin or Drow, and for whatever reason, their spirit guide has to be one whose physical form, in life, had been very similar to the form of the new Kaiser. There aren't a lot of 7-foot-tall Fadelands elves to be found in this part of the Shadowfell, and thus Viktor, having been a rare tall drow, would probably not be chosen again. Once, a very long time ago, there was a drow assassin. He was said to have never failed to kill his target, so lethal and reliable that, within a century, his name came to be used by people as a word meaning success in battle. His master, a powerful noblewoman, would trot him out sometimes to intimidate opponents. He was easily recognizable, for his physical stature was massive, allowing him to tower over those who courted her favor, while their eyes were drawn to the deadly, unwieldy-looking hammer he wielded, an intimidating rectangle of metal, pitch black like drow skin. Yet of all the things that marked him unusual, not least was his loyalty. There's an expression that all drow carry two blades, one pointed in front toward their enemies, and one pointed behind for their friends. The troubles and turmoils they suffered before the founding of their great cities taught these Eldar of the Underdark to trust no one, not even each other. Schemes, betrayals, and coups of all kind were always brewing among them, and no one was immune, save only the Spider Empress herself, who was said to have eyes in every shadow, and whose mythic might was beyond challenge. Viktor never betrayed his master, never plotted against her. There's no sign that he ever even considered such a thing. But as her power grew, attracting new and powerful advisors, some of them twisted the governor against him. Her other most faithful servants were trustworthy because she had uncovered their plots, confronted them, and forced them to give up on ever supplanting her. Through blackmail and intimidation, she owned them now, in every sense. But she had never found any trace of Viktor's scheming, and in the end became paranoid that his maneuvering was too subtle for her to uncover. And so, in the end, she had him killed, in his sleep, something nobody else could have arranged, because she was the only one he trusted. Perhaps he was slain without his 2 coins to pay the ferryman, per drow superstitions, or perhaps this betrayal stung his soul so badly that Viktor could not rest. But whatever the case, his essence did not find his way to the afterlife, lingering instead between worlds for endless centuries, until Swain brought him back by binding him to Kaiser, giving him ample opportunities to work out his frustrations on the king's enemies. Darktrees were a concept I had very early on, as evidenced by one showing up in the very first adventure, the Drow Mines, which was so quickly skimmed over by episode 1. That section alone was actually 3 game sessions, if I recall. I liked the idea of there being some number of these things, just giant columns of spirit biomass extending from their roots at the surface, touching the sky, far down into the Underdark into Shadowfell, with branches stretching out, just absorbing and thriving off the 2 main sources of the Shadowfell's peculiar planar energy. The depths, where it generally grows stronger the deeper down you go, and paradoxically, the shallow sky itself. These colossal, generally immobile spirits are intelligent and, in fact, psionic, yet rarely communicate with others, as they spend eternity soaking in the darkness. Now, I had this concept of Shadowfell energy from the beginning as well, but at some point much later on, I realized that it lined up a little bit with the Underdark energy that the Drow use in Forgotten Realms. So I looked up and stole their word for it, Firesres, as a little deep cuts bonus for fans of the published settings. Because I very much like making the setting feel even larger by using the implied baggage from names people recognize from other media. Just like how naming a vampire king Vladimir immediately evokes a certain constellation of ideas of what a vampire king is like. Different people may have very different ideas depending on which versions of Dracula they remember and which they prefer. But as a distant past figure, it's not actually important that all those ideas be correct for my Vladimir character. It adds ambiance either way, but since I didn't actually support those ideas, it shouldn't be too hard to adapt your assumptions later on if more info on TDDC's Vlad becomes available. Like him falling in love with a half-frost giant called Cornello, who was mortal at the time. That same thing, borrowing cultural baggage, applies for Firesres, for whatever small proportion of viewers even get the reference. As for the prophecy, it's really not anything I expect the party to interact with further. It's not part of their story. Partly there because as much as I want the players to have the ability to change the world, hopefully in really big ways, I also want them to feel like the world keeps moving when they aren't there, and not everything is about them. I also thought it was an interesting decision to see if they would pay a really high cost. A permanent loss of a stat, especially Constitution, is a huge hit, for a vague benefit. The effects on the world was explicitly far off. They knew it was supposed to protect against divination, but they had no way to know it would be as strong as permanent level 20 non-detection. It was interesting to see they all went along without knowing the details of this reward. Despite how intimidating Asmodeus looks, in our setting, it is very difficult for him to extend his influence beyond the Hells, except in the form of nightmares. Few demons or devils ever manage to reach the planes where mortals live, but virtually everyone has to sleep. That said, there is this anomaly, this strange quirk of history or divinity or geography that has left the realm of the Albtraum here, in this corner of the Shadowfell, as a sort of outpost of hell. Why does it exist? What purpose does it serve? Difficult questions, maybe unanswerable, but the Albtraum is real, and not to be taken lightly. I'm a little annoyed that I forgot to carve out his space in early Shadowfell maps on the show. Could this demigod, who is said to be locally nigh omnipotent, actually erase an intruding vampire king? Hard to say. But it certainly speaks volumes that they do not try to enter. And it has been said, if it has stats, it can be killed. Well, there's no stat block for the Albtraum in his own domain. My incredible Patreon patrons get extras videos about a week early so I can answer a bunch of their questions in the final video, like these. Sneer Alexander asked,
I thought Delvash was the stand-in for the various fiends and such in your world. How does he interact with Asmodeus?
Delvash is the god most responsible for many of the bad monsters and such that are in the world. Asmodeus, as a distant god, has massive power over his domain. He gets to torment a lot of souls, but he always wants more, wants to extend his reach into the physical world. And those rare demons or devils who do make it into the three planes of mortals serve Asmodeus quite directly, whereas Delvash, like most gods, can push, pull, and prod many or most mortals by degrees, indirectly, but generally only directly command the priests or champions whom they empower. Basically, when there's bad stuff going on, Delvash is usually involved, at least at the fuzzy, promoting greed, malice, and darkness sense. And Asmodeus is usually not, though he can try to mess with people in their dreams, sending nightmares to distort their emotions and lead them astray. Conceptually, if you view the gods as being involved in everything, then sometimes the two are working together, sometimes they are competing. Generally, though, Delvash affects your life, and if you follow the will of Delvash, there's a good chance Asmodeus will be the one to toy with you after you die. Essedmanal asked, is the realm of the Albtraum linked to how Face Crusher made his way into the material world? I mean, it seems that some information, in the physics sense, must come out of there. It's not a black hole that erases everything it enters. Otherwise, how does Rygax have any information on it at all? Mr. Top Hat 9 asked, are the thin trees with those leaves in the Feywild equivalent to the Darktrees? It sounds like they feed in similar ways. Yeah. That's a good question, but I'm afraid not. Those weird Fey trees, the bluish ones, I think, I'm colorblind, I don't know, are just ordinary wildlife in that region, adapted to the properties of the plane. If there were a Fey equivalent to the Darktrees, they would presumably extend much farther up than mere hundreds of feet. And if the Darktrees are representative of their plane, you would think a Fey equivalent would be less solid and or hidden and or immobile. Of course, it probably couldn't be the opposite in all of those ways, or else they would be giant, obvious columns up into the sky, which presumably everyone would have noticed. So maybe there's no equivalent, or maybe the equivalent is something so entirely different that it can't be directly compared like we're trying to. Or whatever. Timofey Preslov asked, the non-detection or whatever given by the Darktree is making your location a secret. Does that mean it's connected to Vecna? Especially if those things are from the Shadowfell, which was shaped by Vecna. The plane was created primarily by Vecna's energies from the source, whether intentionally or through sheer disregard for the consequences. Because of that, the plane as a whole leans toward the hidden, the parasitic, and the undead. But since the Darktrees live off absorbing and concentrating the planar energy, they must carry some of those traits within themselves. William Bailey asked,
Was there anything the party could have done to arrive in time to save the people of the sanctuary from being stomped into the dirt? And can you tell us anything about who they were and what they'd accomplished before dying?
I mean, it was largely rigged, but if they had pulled out some fast travel spell or ability I didn't expect, like, say they cast a single phantasmal mount and gave it to Angel to scout the place, I think I would have had to give them credit for that bold action in some way. Then again, Angel showing up alone to catch Kaiser before or during the slaughter may not have been an ideal scenario either, but who knows what other things they might have tried if they could save scum TDDC, like you might keep saving and retrying a same encounter in a single-player computer RPG. As for who they were, given they were all dead and thus not especially relevant to the PCs, I simplify it by describing them as all elves, the tall Fadelands kind. But while most of them were, there were actually two main groups. A colony who were the survivors and descendants of a colony of elven explorers from a long time ago, and a second group who formed from Eladrin, the smaller Feywild Eldar, who had become trapped on the far side of the continent from their homelands when the Formian infestation took over a big chunk of the Feywild. Not that it was by any means impossible for them to have gotten back by land, sea, or air. All could technically be done, and a number of Eladrin did make their way back, while others died trying. But through a harrowing journey, a number of them eventually ended up in this part of the Shadowfell where Rygax found them and led them to shelter with the elves, who themselves had altered and expanded this small cave network, which had been a sanctuary of sorts even before them. And then, of course, some player characters were due to arrive, and these people all became collateral damage, slain by a duo who had a grudge against both Rygax and others of their own kind. Trentos01 asked,
As combatants, just how elite are the party compared to the vast majority of the world by now? Not counting epic-tier things like Mindhunters and Vampire Kings. Because I'd imagine that the hundreds of zombies posted at the spring should, in theory, be able to do something against attackers, but I can't see them being much more than an annoyance for the party.
At this point, the party are pretty epic, by most people's standards. Regular zombies are mostly only used by the kings because they are there. They often function as speed bumps, as an early warning system, and large numbers of them make it harder to swarm a location with other low-level crap. 2,000 zombies are a good defense against packs of wolves, swarms of Corbinoids, those xenomorph-looking scorpion things, etc., as well as against monsters whose only power is size. For example, Mr. Floppy would flatten a lot of zombies if he was sent on a kamikaze run at the spring, but if there are 4-digit numbers of them, they could swarm him and wear him down enough he may not even make it, and there'd still be hundreds and hundreds of zombies left. Dimon asked,
I have a lot of interesting ideas for the giant sword, and beside it just got this. Did you have any ideas about it, or was it just appropriate gear for the giant death knight?
I just had some ideas and went balls to the wall on making it A, cool, and B, inconvenient. Totally could have been worth it though, in my opinion, if somebody wanted to really lean into it. Willful G asked,
Are there any Itaran remnants in the Shadowfell? Considering they basically had an all-out war against the Vampire Kings. Also, when was the Lich battle?
There are almost certainly significant numbers of destroyed Warforged and larger war machines, ruined forward bases, and probably a number of magic and magitech items out there. Presumably the vast majority of that stuff would lie in the territories of Hastings and Alyssa, plus some in Lockhart's western holdings. As for the Lich King, I'm not pinning that down, but it is definitely before Cornello. Vlad's death was only a couple centuries ago, and it is definitely after the demise of Lolth. That was a very old event. 3C273 asked, in a very boring voice because I'm starting to get tired,
How long have plot points like the Vampire Kings, Mind Hunters, Little One's Father, and the Prophecy been parts of your vision of the world? How long have they been detailed?
I would say I started caring about the Mind Hunters after the party made a deal with the Rajas. Up till then, I thought the most likely turn would be for them to kill Lord Kintamazu, turning the Rajas, or at least his vengeful brother, Lord Kinokoro, into the big bad for at least an arc. Like a computer game that loads areas dynamically as you approach them, I try to fill out aspects of the world most likely to interact with the PCs as they get closer to interacting with them. Even if those interactions are quite indirect, like them and the Vampire Kings way back when they showed up in Vistria. Little One's father was one of those ones where I didn't know exactly what to do with him. The player just said, I have no idea who he was, or if he's still alive. I just know he left. I just sort of let that stay in the background until I happened to get some interesting ideas for who he was. 3C273 also asked,
Was Swain meant to be the primary Vampire King antagonist for the party? Could the South King, Lockhart, I think, have been the main focus of the party if they'd stayed in Lorik for whatever reason?
Based on when I started focusing on the Vampire Kings, like enough to start actually differentiating them, the party were already on their way to Vistria, so I focused mainly on the ones whose territories correspond to somewhere near Vistria, which means mainly Swain, Cornello, and or Alyssa. Ultralight asked, Oi, seems like the trees in Albtrom domain rise above the ceiling of the plane. Does Albtrom actually have the power to set the ceiling of the plane in his domain? I mean, they shouldn't be able to change it directly. That's the ceiling of the plane. There's nothing above it. On the other hand, if the Albtrom can change everything within their realm, they could certainly remold the terrain up and down to some degree, and we know that changes in terrain cause corresponding adjustments in the ceiling over the course of centuries. So the next episode, number 55, is probably going to be a slow one because there's crazy stuff going on in it. But hopefully I'll have at least one extra video in the meantime. There's so much other stuff I want to get done, but I don't know how I'm ever going to get ahead. Another gaming comic is still chugging along at demonac.com/agccomic, and I put up the first half of the series in PDF for the Lore Master patrons, with director's commentary on most of them. It's only about 40 strips ahead of the live release, but I'm hoping to give Lore Masters the complete series PDF within the next couple months. I hope you are all staying safe, following your local physical distancing rules, and if you lose income, please take care of your family first before giving that to people on Patreon. That said, thanks again for supporting me in these crazy times. With a special shout out to Aether Mordu, Armok Jobi, Begrin, Bedemir, Gorlin, Gernlin, Duskmar, Demon, Fright Knight, Earl of Sanguine, Get Hype, Fireborn, Greenmute, Gorfiend, Hakun, Havoc, John, 9, Leacrow, Lonito, Lord Avon, Melson Dish, MJ3D, Olden Man, OI1, Pedrig of Rooney, Pontus, Remar Ulfist, Repmock, Stan the Man, Starfall, Surf USA, Tambu, und June, Skater97, Toshiro 7, Velis, Folkfang, Woodley, Warsword. No, it's Warsword. Warsword. Warsword is what I said. And Zombie. Members of organization.